What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And today's video, I'm just going to go ahead and warn you now, it is definitely one of the more challenging cases that I've spoken about. Today, we are going to be talking about the life and the heartbreaking loss of a 10-year-old little girl named Emani Moss. But before we dive into the details, it's important for me to let you guys know and just remind you that Ammani was so much more than the headlines about her. She's more than the trial, the verdict, and all of the really tragic circumstances surrounding her death. Ammani was also a 10-year-old little girl, you guys. I have a kid that age. She loved to read. She loved to laugh and play with her friends. She loved school. She would sing under her breath when she thought no one was looking. She was a sister and a daughter and a student. And if you ask anyone that truly knew her in her short life, she was one of the sweetest, calmest kids that you could ever meet. And that makes her story so much more challenging to tell because despite her vibrant smile and all of the beautiful things she brought to the world, there were the darkest of shadows in Ammani's life that many of us will never fully understand. And the way this truth came to light, the call to the police, the scene that investigators walked into, has haunted everyone that has ever learned about what happened to Emani Moss. So let's go ahead and get right into the details. Emani Gabrielle Moss was born on April 23rd, 2003 in Georgia. She was a small but healthy baby. She had a head full of soft dark hair and these big old eyes that seemed to just take in everything around her. And from the very beginning, unfortunately, life presented challenges for her. Emani's biological mother struggled with drug addiction. And so at some point when Emani was a very small baby still, her mother ended up either losing custody of her or gave up her parental rights. But from that point forward, Emani ended up living with her father, Emani Moss. So for about half of her life, she lived at her grandmother's house on her paternal side with her grandmother and her father, surrounded by a loving family. And those that knew them in those early years remember seeing Ammani carry Emani into church. They regularly ventured out into town together. They seemed like a happy, average family. Ammani was a sweet, quiet little girl, but she wasn't withdrawn. Even though she was quiet, she was more so the kind of kid that wanted to just sit and watch and listen before joining conversation. She was so respectful. All the teachers remembered she always said please and thank you without ever needing any reminders. She kind of carried herself with this old soul demeanor, and a lot of people took notice. She was like a little peacekeeper. She was a people pleaser. She was always the first to solve problems. If she had issues with anyone at school, her teachers said that she would quickly attempt to mend the relationships and make everyone happy again. Ammani didn't have a mean bone in her entire body. She was just the easiest kid to get along with. She loved reading, especially books that allowed her to kind of imagine herself in a faraway place. She liked fairy tales and adventure stories, anything with a small hint of magic in it. And if she wasn't reading, she was typically drawing pictures, characters out of her books maybe, or crafting her own stories. And like I mentioned before, she just had this thing where she would sing or hum under her breath while she was coloring. She was just so happy and content in the small things. Family members have described her as being soft and shy, but when she was around trusted cousins and friends, that's when she really seemed to come out of her shell. She loved to play and be part of games. She was a typical energetic child at the same time. She was always running around and playing with other kids at church and at family gatherings, laughing and playing tag. But as warm as all of those early memories are, they unfortunately were so heavily overshadowed. So in 2007, Ammani met a young woman named Tiffany at their church. Over the course of the next 2 years, they actually only remained acquaintances. So like they would get together at church or they would get together outside with church friends. But in 2009, there was a shift between Ammani and Tiffany. They began dating. And by this point, she had her degree. She was working as a preschool teacher. And so on paper, she had all the makings of a positive role model in a child's life, which seemed to be what Ammani and his family were really hoping for Ammani. This might be another source of stability for her, someone who could help raise her and encourage her schooling because of her educational background. And so far, Ammani had really lacked that motherly figure in her life. It doesn't seem like her biological mother was really a part of it at all. And so a lot of people saw this relationship as a really good thing for everyone. And so Tiffany and Amon's relationship moved really quickly. And by the end of 2009, I think after only like 8 or so months of dating, the two of them ended up getting married. And not long after, Tiffany gave birth to 2 more children, a little boy first and then a little girl. And these were Ammani's half siblings. And from the outside, it might have looked like Ammani's life was settling into a new stable chapter. She kind of finally had this family unit that she hadn't really had all to herself before. She had this stepmom to look up to. She now had siblings. But those who saw the family up close and personal noticed a bit of a difference. Tiffany's warmth kind of seemed to be reserved for her biological children. With Ammani, there just always seemed to be kind of like a chill in her tone, like a lack of affection that didn't go unnoticed. I was just talking about this in another one of my videos, and unfortunately, this is something that often happens. Cinderella, Cinderella. Now, Ammani, however, like I said, was the kind of child that loved to please, and so she kept her voice soft. She tried to follow the rules carefully. She worked hard in school, but soon little cracks started to show. And for the people that paid attention, those cracks were extreme warning signs. But unfortunately, the people who held the most power to save Ammani, to look at these warning signs and put her in a place where she would be safe, it just didn't happen. Just after 4 a.m. on November 2nd, 2013, a call came into Gwinnett County 911 Center. And on the other end of the line was 33-year-old Emani Moss, Ammani's father. And his voice was flat, almost lifeless, as he told the dispatcher way too casually that his daughter, Ammani, was dead. He claimed that she had ingested chemicals and that she was in the apartment with him and he didn't know what to do. But this wasn't the full truth. And investigators would very quickly learn that the reality was far worse than the words coming through that phone line. Now, the dispatcher is hearing all of this and she's trying to keep herself calm and press for as many details as she can get. But Ammani really wasn't giving any, other than the fact that he lived at the Landmark at Coventry Point Apartments in Lawrenceville, Georgia, and he would be sitting there waiting for authorities. As the questions continued, Ammani quietly added something else, that he was thinking about harming himself. Now, police were told because of this to prepare for an attempt when they arrived, that they needed to go and make sure they did a welfare check on him as well. Now, a lot of sources have said this was a miscommunication and that he never said that, but that was still relayed to police. So when they showed up, that is what they prepared for. And so minutes later, patrol cars pulled into the complex, not sure what they were going to find, and they spotted Ammani standing outside near the front of Building 15. And so officers approached and detained him immediately for safety so he couldn't harm himself, and they began trying to piece together what he had told dispatch. And at this point, all they know is there's this 10-year-old little girl who somehow ingested chemicals in the middle of the night into the early morning hours, and now her father is claiming that she is dead. But instead of directing them up to his 3rd-floor apartment where he had told the dispatcher Ammani's body was, things got so wildly disturbing. Ammani instead pointed to a galvanized trash can sitting on the grass across the parking lot. So authorities are like, okay, we're going to approach this trash can. Not sure what they were going to find. And when they pulled back the lid, inside was a black garbage bag. And when they very carefully opened the black garbage bag, inside were the charred remains of 10-year-old Emani Moss. Ammani was in a fetal type position. She had her arms kind of down to her sides and her knees were up to her chest. But strangely, it was duct tape to stay that way. Like there was duct tape wound around her arms and legs to make sure, I guess, she stayed in a small enough position to fit in the can. She had been wrapped in a comforter, and in a secondary bag, there were several other items. I don't know exactly what they were, maybe towels or blankets or something, but it was clear right away that all of them were soaked in urine. One seasoned investigator later said that it was a sight and a smell that they would never forget. Like, you knew what was in this trash can before you even opened the lid. So at the scene, officers began pressing Ammani for more details because they're like, what on earth happened to your daughter? Okay. You initially reported that Ammani died after ingesting chemicals, but that doesn't really line up with Ammani ending up inside of a black garbage bag in a trash can wrapped in duct tape. And so when they started to say, hey, look, this isn't really matching up, his story ended up shifting. And so at this point, Ammani told authorities that she had in fact ingested chemicals. That really was what happened. But now he added that he and his wife, Tiffany, after she ingested chemicals, found her dead. And they both panicked. They had no idea what to do. They didn't want to get in trouble. So they both came to the decision that the best option to protect themselves was to burn Ammani's body. And so authorities are hearing this and they're like, okay, like this is kind of tiptoeing closer to what we think the truth probably is, but something is still off, because when they had looked at Ammani, not only was she disturbingly charred, like she had bits of burnt clothes all over her body, like the blanket she was wrapped in was burned, but that still wasn't one of the most disturbing parts about when they discovered her. She was so emaciated. Authorities pointed out that there were obvious signs of severe malnutrition. Ammani's frame was skeletal, legitimately reduced to skin and bones. And so they're like, okay, we hear you on this whole chemical thing, and, maybe you did try to hide this. But when you pair that with this child clearly being emaciated, something is so very wrong. And this detail broke through whatever was holding Ammani back from telling the truth. And instead, he changed his story again. At this point, Ammani admitted that Ammani had never actually ingested chemicals at all. Instead, he started to detail one of the most horrific things authorities had ever heard. Ammani claimed that over the past several weeks, Tiffany Moss, Ammani's wife and Ammani's stepmother, had been deliberately starving Ammani, and that this prolonged deprivation had actually led to her death. And so in a panic, they tried to get rid of Ammani so they wouldn't get in trouble. The reality was that Tiffany had killed Ammani, and Ammani had just watched it happen. So by sunrise that morning, both Ammani and Tiffany Moss were under arrest. Now, Ammani was obviously taken into custody on scene, but Tiffany wasn't there, and Ammani ended up telling authorities that she had just left before he made the 911 call. She had loaded up their other two children, and she more than likely had gone to her mother's home. And so authorities went there, but couldn't locate Tiffany. Her two other children were there, but thankfully, within hours, Tiffany ended up just turning herself in, and she actually approached an officer in a neighboring county, and she identified herself. She's like, hey, look, police apparently want to talk to me. They've already arrested my husband. And they actually had to do like some Googling to see what on earth she was talking about. And that's when they found out Ammani had been arrested, what he was arrested for, Ammani being found. And so they connected the dots, and Gwinnett County came out to transport Tiffany to face the charges and what would soon be revealed as a long and horrific case of abuse. Now, from that horrific discovery, investigators were stunned. They had just pulled the burned remains of an emaciated 10-year-old girl from a trash can in an otherwise quiet apartment complex. And Ammani at this point was giving them pieces of a story, but there were parts that made sense, parts that didn't, and parts that seemed way too horrifying to be real. And so they wanted to know, how had things gotten this bad? Is he telling the truth? Like, how does it reach a point where a little girl's life ends like this, as if she had been nothing? And so detectives knew they were going to need more answers, not just about Ammani's death, but also about her life. So they went back through every department, Through every DFCS record, every single school report, every police contact, every medical file that had Ammani's name on it, Tiffany, on the other hand, was sitting there eerily silent. But ultimately, the bigger picture started to come together, and it was devastating. Ammani had been failed by nearly every person and agency in a position to protect her. So, to understand how this even got to this point, we have to go back in time. Now, up until Tiffany entered the picture in Ammani's life, while not perfect, was relatively stable. I've already kind of walked you through how she had, a really active life. She was in church. She was doing well in school. She was around her family regularly. She was living with them her whole life at that point. But the stability began to shift almost immediately after Ammani married Tiffany. Ammani, who had once been an active and joyful part in the family, had started to become quieter. And it wasn't just because she was simply growing up or adjusting to changes in her home life. She seemed specifically more timid. Like she was scared of doing something wrong all the time. She was always scared of getting into trouble. And while Ammani and Ammani had spent years living around family, once Tiffany was in the picture, they kind of went off grid. And so family started to see less and less of Ammani. There was no consistent way to contact them. They bounced around homes a lot, so no one seemed to know their address for sure. They were just very loose acquaintances with Tiffany. And while she had seemed like this great person, she's involved in church. She shared a lot of the different morals and beliefs that Ammani and his family did. She had this education in early childhood development. They just couldn't shake that something was off, but they couldn't yet see just how bad things would become. As investigators kept rewinding through the timeline, one thing became very clear. Because Ammani didn't seem to be surrounded by family after her father got married, other than her dad and stepmom, Ammani's school seemed to be one of the few places where what was going on was visible and reported. Now, from the moment she stepped foot into school, Ammani had been a quiet but eager learner. School was her happy place. It was her safe place. She absolutely loved it. But just like family, teachers also started to notice changes in early 2010, right after her dad and Tiffany got married. Ammani started to become more withdrawn. They also started to notice that her clothes weren't always fitting properly. And sometimes she came to school so hungry, it seemed like she wasn't even being fed at home. And while a lot of kids go through different phases and growth spurts, and this is a pretty big life change for her, this seemed different. And no one could quite put their finger on it, but eventually it was confirmed when Ammani started to confide in the school counselor. She began to tell them that she was scared to go home. She said that she didn't want to spend the night there. There was even more of this fear of getting into trouble, of being punished. She was scared for report cards to go home. If there maybe wasn't the best grade or homework wasn't turned in on time, the teachers would have to write notes to be sent home to the parents. And this seemed to send Ammani into just an emotional spiral of fear. The little girl that used to be so organized had pretty much stopped bringing in homework altogether. And so obviously it was pretty frequent when these notes had to be sent home. And this wasn't making sense to teachers because it was a huge stark contrast to her ability to perform all of her work in school very successfully, like she always did. And so no one understood why all of a sudden none of her homework was ever coming in. And then there was just this overwhelming feeling of stress radiating from Ammani. But unfortunately, at this point, there wasn't really anything anyone could do other than try to support Ammani however they could through whatever she may be going through and hope that eventually things got better. But unfortunately, by March of 2010, so literally just months into the school year, the concern became impossible to ignore. It was no longer just these verbal complaints and kind of small oddities noticed in her behavior. Ammani, this time, showed up to school with welts and bruises across her arms and her back and her chest. And the school nurse is taking all of this in, horrified, and, gently asks what happened. Like, how did you sustain all of these injuries? And Ammani said with a straight face, Tiffany had beaten her with a belt. Apparently, Tiffany had given her 5 minutes to complete her homework that morning, and because she was unable to complete all of it in those 5 minutes, Tiffany beat her for it. Now, the school staff at this point, they did everything right and by the book. From the way it seems, they had basically been waiting for a moment they could finally ring the alarm about something going on in Ammani's home. And so the injuries were all photographed, they were documented and reported. DFCS was immediately on the case to figure out what was going on. Ammani was called and he showed up right away and could not even begin to explain how Ammani could have injuries like this. But Tiffany, who they really wanted to speak to, didn't come in for questioning or answer phone calls until hours after the fact. Tiffany ultimately came in, I want to say about 3 or 4 hours after authorities had been trying to reach her after this incident was reported. And when she did come in, she did ultimately admit that she had, in fact, whipped Ammani with a belt. She said that Ammani had behavioral issues and she failed to do her homework, and that she only hit her 3 times. She just said it so nonchalant, like this was a completely normal way to treat a child. And she was trying to downplay it, but the injuries were not at all consistent with that. Ammani had marks all over her. This wasn't an instant where the belt was like folded in half and she was smacked, which was what Tiffany was trying to claim. The belt was quite literally lashed at Ammani hard enough that there were wrap marks around her arms and torso. Like this belt wrapped around her arms and left devastating bruises. And it seems like Ammani had no clue any of this was going on in the home, or at least he was pretending to have no idea this was going on. And so because of how extreme these injuries were, and it was not matching up with what Tiffany was claiming happened, Tiffany was arrested and charged with first-degree child cruelty. Ammani was thankfully immediately removed from the home, and she was placed into temporary care with her paternal grandmother. And this was someone that she had lived with for years, majority of her childhood at this point. She had a great relationship with her grandmother. And for a moment, it looked like the system was going to protect her, that it was going to work as it should. And for 6 months, she was living with her grandmother. She completed the school year, and the school reported directly to DFCS that Ammani's personality was shining again. It was like a flip had switched. Her grades had gone back up. Her homework was being turned back in again. This happy, bubbly, sweet little girl was back to being herself. It was as obvious as could be that the environment that she had been in before was drowning her. Whatever was going on in that home was literally sucking the soul and the light out of this little girl. But despite doing everything right, despite the charges, and despite the positive changes in Ammani in those 6 months, it all fell apart. Tiffany was able to take a plea under Georgia's First Offender Act. And so instead of any jail time, she was given 5 years of probation. She was ordered to attend parenting classes, and she was allowed to go back home, not only to her 2 biological children, but unfortunately, Ammani as well. And this didn't go without a fight. Ammani's grandmother desperately protested and tried to have the rights given to her. She wanted to be the guardian of Ammani. She even asked Amman if she could keep Ammani, saying that she was doing so well. But Amman said that he wanted his daughter back. He wanted to prove that he could care for her properly and that it was a safe home. But that's not at all what ended up happening.
You filed a lawsuit against DFCS, and you were describing sort of, you were claiming in there that they knew about this, that you reached out, you tried to warn people, you said everything, you did everything you could legally. You said grandma.
Yeah.
And sort of what's your reaction when you see how it played out and you're sitting there and you're like, I did what I could?
I feel bad because it's like no matter how much I fought, it was just like no one there to help me. No one. No matter how many times I went down there, and I took my sisters, I took a lot of people down there to fight. Down to DFCS to fight them because they wanted me to give her back, and I didn't want to give her back after the 6 months. And then they put her back in that home. And I knew that when they put her back in a home, that was it.
When you say that was that sort of when you had that temporary custody of her for that little window and you brought her back, and was that the last time or one of the last times then that she saw her?
Yeah, because when I got her, she was bruised up very, very badly. You know, in her chest, like fingernail marks in her chest, bruises all over her whole body. And I would sit there and rub her down and try to heal her up and get her emotions back up because she was afraid of everything. She got to the point where if she dropped the glass, she'd start running and screaming and going in a corner. I'm like, it's just a glass, baby. Grandma, I'm going to sweep it up and clean it up, but put your shoes on in case I didn't get everything up, you know. But that's just a glass. I can go back to Walmart or wherever I got it and get another glass. That's not important.
She didn't want anyone touching her. She thought there was
She
punishment for everything.
thought it was a punishment for everything, but she knew it wasn't none with me. I wasn't like that. But from being in that house, she came timid. She wasn't herself. She was afraid.
After Ammani returned home in late 2010, Amman and Tiffany began moving more often. They were slowly cutting off contact even more with Amman's extended family. Relatives no longer saw Ammani regularly, and they had little idea what her day-to-day life was like. And for anyone who is aware of any form of abuse, signs of isolation are the biggest red flag you could ever possibly have. Her teachers, however, were still an active presence in Ammani's life. They still saw her in class every single day, and unfortunately, they began noticing the same troubling changes that had been flagged back in 2010. Ammani again started becoming less engaged. She was quieter, more withdrawn. She also, at this point, was getting thinner and thinner as time went on. It was a slow decline, but one that wasn't going unnoticed. So not long after teachers started to be concerned again about Ammani's welfare, more incidents followed. Ammani ran away from home, not once, but twice. In July of 2012, Ammani ended up running away from home, and she was found at the leasing office of, I believe, their apartment complex where the family was living at the time. And when she was questioned, Ammani ended up telling authorities that Tiffany had tied her up with belts and put her under cold water in the shower. So authorities went to Tiffany to hear what she had to say, and for her part, she denied it completely. Tiffany claimed to authorities that Ammani was just acting out because she resented the fact that her father had remarried and had children, which should have immediately been kind of questionable because they had already been married for several years at this point, and Tiffany had been an active part in Ammani's life even 2 years before that, when Ammani was, 4 years old. And so it wasn't like Tiffany was just this brand new person in her life. Honestly, I think that was one of the first instances of projection. I think the reality was that Tiffany was actually jealous of Ammani. Now, Tiffany went on to say that what Ammani said about being tied up with belts and put under the shower couldn't possibly be true because of those 2010 charges. She said that from the point of those charges on, she no longer did any of the disciplining when it came to Ammani. And so anytime anything happened with Ammani, it was Amman's job to handle it. And so she said, well, because of that, there's no way that I would have done it. It was basically just made to seem like Ammani was a rebellious little lying child. And authorities were not able to find any sort of visible marks on Ammani to corroborate her account. There was no one else that had been there to witness anything. And so no action was taken other than Ammani being returned back home. And so not long after this first incident, still in July, Ammani ran away a second time. Now, Amman came home from work and Tiffany casually told him, hey, by the way, Ammani's been gone for 2 hours now. Tiffany told Amman that she had briefly looked for Ammani, I guess just in the local area, like maybe around the apartment complex, but she hadn't done anything else since. Like she hadn't called police, she hadn't called him while he was at work, so he called 911 himself. Now, officers responded to the scene and everyone started to head out and look for Ammani. And ultimately, they ended up finding her sleeping in the bushes at a neighboring apartment complex. Now, when they found Ammani, she wouldn't say why exactly she ran away. She just expressed this extreme fear of going back home, something that she had consistently been telling so many people since back in early 2010. And so authorities went to Tiffany and Amman to try to figure it out. Why is she running away for a second time? And Tiffany really kind of dug in on Ammani. She claimed that this was actually the 4th time Ammani had run away that month, but I guess only 2 of them had been reported, or maybe they just found her really fast the other 2 times. And so she was seemingly indicating this was like a big behavioral issue on Ammani's part, and that there was nothing going on at home causing her to run other than her apparent jealousy of Tiffany and the other two children. Now, it's not clear what Emani was saying in any of this, if he was coming to his daughter's aid or if he was just sitting there silently and letting Tiffany run the show. But regardless, because Ammani wouldn't say why she ran, there were no indications at all that she had been physically harmed. Yet again, Ammani was sent back to the home. However, it does seem like maybe the officer at this point felt something was going on because he actually put in a juvenile complaint. And it was a complaint about Ammani running away repeatedly. And a lot of the times, if there is suspected abuse or things like that going on, they will put one of these complaints in, even though it looks like it's because of the child, in an attempt to get them in front of people who may be able to get answers out of them and do something more. But unfortunately, it seems like that complaint was never dealt with. There was already a documented history of abuse in her home. Tiffany had already been charged and convicted. And so I feel like that should have made this incident a blaring alarm for the system to step in. I mean, hello, the commonality alone of the use of belt would have absolutely sent me. When a child who has previously shown up with welts from being lashed with a belt, you should probably believe them when they say they were then restrained with belts by the same person. But not just that. There had been an incident just 2 months prior to this with school again. So we're following the same patterns, and it was like not a single person was picking up on it enough to do anything. So back in May 2012, right before Ammani got out of school staff ended up reporting that Ammani showed up to school one day with physical signs of distress. She was complaining of her head hurting, and once again, she ended up admitting to the counselors and school nurse that she had been hit on the head with a belt that morning by Tiffany because, I kid you not, she ate her breakfast too slowly. So now we have a third belt incident following Tiffany's favorite way to destroy this little girl, yet somehow no one did anything. The official finding, and I don't even want to say this out loud because it pisses me off so bad, was, quote, no maltreatment alleged. And it was labeled as, quote, corporal punishment. You gotta be kidding. You've got to be kidding me. At this point, there was a pattern. There were repeated warnings, repeated complaints to DFCS, literally from the year she was born on. There were 6 separate DFCS contacts in her whole life. And somehow, none of it resulted in more oversight after these back-to-back incidents with the school and with her running away. And so Ammani simply went back behind the same closed doors, and life for her continued on the same path, a path that by this point was leading to complete isolation. And I bet you guys can guess what's happening next. I want to see if you guys can guess accurately down below, because I don't know if it's just because I knew it was coming in the research that I was like, wow, I expected that. Or if it's legitimately this disturbingly obvious what usually comes as the next step in isolation. So take a moment to comment down below what you think is about to happen. So months after that report was filed from the school at the end of the year and the runaway incidents, by the following school year, 2013, another change came. One that would take away the last sets of watchful eyes in Ammani's life. If you didn't guess before, I'm sure you're guessing now and literally pulling your hair out. Tiffany and Ammani withdrew Ammani from public school, telling officials that they plan to homeschool her. I swear all of these cases follow the exact same predictable pattern, the exact same one. Now, I want to say really quickly, because I always get a barrage of comments, homeschooling is not inherently bad, you guys, okay? Thousands and thousands of children thrive in home education settings. But there needs to be a huge but in this and huge exceptions in cases where abuse is suspected, especially when it's not only suspected, but there have been prior reports and a documented criminal conviction. That should not be allowed. At that point, you have put this child in the hands of their known abuser. You've removed the child from daily contact they have with mandated reporters, the only ones left in their life. That is absolutely crazy to me. that wasn't questioned at all, okay? Tiffany had been removed from her job as a preschool teacher. Like, she could no longer even use her degree because of her conviction, because of what she did to Ammani. But somehow it was okay for her and Ammani to pull Ammani from school and homeschool her, like, with no oversight. Please tell me in what world that's okay. And so now, without teachers and school nurses or counselors seeing Ammani every day, the only ones that had so far been actively reporting, there was now no one left to notice if she was injured or losing weight or showing signs of neglect or if she had been beaten over breakfast that morning. And this isolation was not accidental. It gave Tiffany complete control over what Ammani could eat, who she could talk to, and whether she could ever reach out for help again. From that point forward, Ammani's world became smaller and smaller and smaller. Neighbors later testified that they rarely saw Ammani after this point. She was no longer seen in the yard. She was no longer seen riding her bike. Neighbors would see her siblings outside playing and having a great time, but Ammani seemed to be a ghost. And to put it into perspective, just how invisible and isolated Ammani had become, her paternal grandmother only saw her twice between late 2010, early 2011, when she was placed back into her father and stepmother's care, and her death in 2013. Now, Ammani's grandmother said that she had repeatedly tried to reach out to see her granddaughter, but she was always met with a wall. And like I said, because Ammani and Tiffany moved around so much, they stayed with Tiffany's mom for a while, or friends, or, it was very rare they had their own place because they struggled with money, because Tiffany couldn't work, because she was an abuser. It was almost impossible to keep track of them. One of the first times Ammani's grandmother saw her was actually at one of Ammani's half-siblings' birthdays. And then the last time that she saw her was on Mother's Day, which would have been just months before she passed and shortly before she was pulled out of school. This happened around the time that the school reported she had been hit in the head with a belt for not eating breakfast fast enough. But there were very obvious other things happening. Ammani's grandmother said she was shocked seeing Ammani that day. Ammani was so thin already at this point that her bones were protruding from her clothing. She stuck to herself. She didn't really play much or talk much, which was a huge contrast to her typical behavior. And despite the fact that she had always loved wearing her hair long, that was like one of Ammani's favorite ways to express herself. She would have ponytails or different braids. Her hair had been cut short. And when Ammani's grandmother asked Tiffany, what's up with Ammani's hair? Like, why is it cut so short? She's never wanted her hair short. She loves her long hair. Tiffany's reply was, if you act ugly, you should look ugly too. Aman's sister also noticed the difference in Ammani on Mother's Day, and she actually asked Aman why Ammani's hair was cut, and he said that Tiffany told him that Ammani had cut her hair herself. And so it was seeming at this point that Tiffany more than likely cut Ammani's hair off. And this ended up being the last time Ammani's family would see her. But there was still one more time that Ammani's horrific condition would be reported to DFCS. Now, someone in those few months either saw her, or maybe it was family that had seen her at Mother's Day and had just been sitting with it and couldn't stay quiet anymore. I'm not really sure, because someone anonymously in August of 2013 reached out to DFCS saying that Ammani was being neglected. This person said that Ammani had basically gone down to skin and bones, that she clearly was not being fed, that there was some sort of abuse happening in the home, and this had been a history. But because this person was unable to give authorities or DFCS contact information for Ammani or Tiffany, or a current address, no home visitor follow-up was done. DFCS screened it out and did nothing. And that was the last chance they had to save her. It's never going to get easier to sit down and tell these stories about children that rely on adults to protect them and stick up for them and be their voice because they really don't have one in this world. I'm never going to get used to it being ignored and then being failed. Like, how can so many people report the same things over and over and over again and nothing be done? How do you sleep at night knowing that you screened an allegation like that, knowing the history, knowing that these match up with the same complaints everyone else has had? I'll never understand it. And I want to give so many people the benefit of the doubt. And I know it is not easy working as a caseworker with DFCS. But come on, like, it's one thing when it's a singular, random complaint and allegation. But when you have years of history from the moment this child was born, why didn't you protect her? Now, by the time investigators pieced this disgusting timeline together, the bruises, the arrest, the probation, the runaway, the school withdrawal, the isolation, they understood that this wasn't a tragedy that came out of nowhere. This was years of documented abuse that had been known about but never fully stopped. Ammani had slowly been cut off from every person and place that could have protected her over the course of 3 years. And the only people who saw her every day up until the point that she died were the same people that had been harming her. Now, investigators ended up being told by Ammani while they questioned him that Tiffany's treatment of Ammani had escalated into systematic starvation. And so this wasn't just occasional missed meals as punishment. It was pretty deliberate, prolonged deprivation that was carried out over weeks, if not possibly months. It seems from some of the reports from the school that she very obviously was going without meals pretty regularly, but she was still sustained enough for it to not raise too many red flags immediately after Ammani and Tiffany got married. But in those last few weeks to last few months, it had escalated a lot. Now, as I already said, from 2011 to 2013, Ammani and her two siblings were living with other people. They spent time with Tiffany's mom and friends and other people that could kind of see the family dynamic and keep an eye out. And so I'm sure it was only done when no one was looking, and only to the extent in which someone wouldn't question it. But in September of 2013, just a month before Ammani's death, the family had moved into their own apartment. So basically, this gave Tiffany a private place to make Ammani's life a living hell every single day, because at this point, she wasn't even going to school. She was trapped in the same four walls as her abuser. Now, Ammani admitted to authorities that he had always believed in spanking as discipline. That was how he grew up, but that eventually they ended up turning to other forms because Tiffany believed that Ammani's behavior was awful. I guess she would regularly send Ammani text messages while he was at work about how bad Ammani was being and all the awful things that she was doing, because Ammani was working 2 jobs at this point pretty regularly since the point that Tiffany and Ammani got married. He at least was working very, very long hours. So Tiffany seemed to be one of the main people active in Ammani's life. And so Tiffany would send these texts like, she's doing this, she's doing that, she's so bad. And she would commonly refer to Ammani as evil. And so I guess she claimed the typical discipline of spanking that they agreed upon wasn't enough. And so she claimed that withholding food was another way they could discipline Ammani, and it might be a little more extreme and get her to behave better. And so, like I said, in the months leading up to Ammani's death, Ammani was working 2 shifts to be able to afford their apartment. And so he was actually only home for like 3 or 4 hours a day, usually in the middle of the night. Like, he was usually home from like 1 to 4 or 5 a.m., and that was it. So he very rarely saw his children. When he would switch from his first job to his second, he would come home, but I think it was only for probably like an hour, maybe even 30 minutes. So he claimed that he wasn't aware of just how bad things were, which maybe he didn't personally see what Tiffany was doing and all the time she failed to give Ammani food, but you're never going to convince me that he didn't see his daughter wasting away and he just did nothing. And because of what he told authorities, he clearly knew that this starvation technique for discipline was something that Tiffany was practicing. And he obviously didn't tell her not to. But it went so much further than that. Ammani was not just being punished by having meals taken away. Her meals became almost non-existent. Tiffany would send Ammani texts saying, just fed all the kids, She would send photos of food that she made. But based on the way Ammani's weight was dropping, it was clear that she had no place at their dinner table. And Amman told authorities that on weekends, when he would take over the care of the kids so that Tiffany could be with friends and family, he said he always fed Ammani, but he noticed that Ammani would gorge herself. It was almost like he was trying during his questioning and during the future trials to distance himself from the reality of what he ultimately ignored. And so he was making all sorts of excuses. He was like, yeah, well, I saw Ammani was losing weight, but she had a growth spurt. And so he attributed it to that. And then he said because she gorged herself on the weekends, he figured it wasn't that she wasn't eating. Maybe something else was going on, but I guess that wasn't enough to warrant a trip to the doctor to see why she was losing weight so rapidly. But clearly, like I said, at some point, he realized that Tiffany had been starving Ammani, because he then went on to tell the police that he started to sneak her scraps. So he would bring her a cracker or a piece of fruit. Like, why are you having to sneak past your wife to feed your daughter? Okay? I mean, hello. But obviously, that was not going to be enough. Ammani's small body could not keep up with the level of neglect that she was enduring. And so by late October, she had gotten to the point where she was so emaciated, she was so weak, she could barely stand. Her body at this point had entered full starvation mode. And still, y'all, Amman just didn't do anything. According to him, he just continued watching his firstborn child waste away. He told authorities that her hair had started to come out. Her cheeks had sunken in. She was so weak she could barely stand for more than a few moments at a time, and so he would occasionally help her stand. But still, there were no calls to authorities. There were no welfare checks, no doctor's visits. No one who had the power to remove her from this home was even able to intervene in those final days because Amman and Tiffany had so successfully pulled her away from all other eyes. And to give you an idea of just how bad it was, according to medical experts, by the time Ammani passed away, her body was severely dehydrated. Several of her organs were much smaller than they should be for her age, and she weighed, 10 years old, only 32 pounds. She was the average weight of a 4-year-old. And those last days of October 2013, Ammani's world was officially just reduced to 4 walls, silence, and hunger. It was a slow and visible violence, one that left her without the strength to fight or even cry for help. And this leads us to Ammani's death. Amman told authorities that on October 24th, 2013, he ended up coming home and Tiffany casually told him that something was not right with Ammani. And so he ended up finding Ammani in the bathtub and she was convulsing and what he assumed was a seizure. And she was entirely unresponsive otherwise. And so Amman claimed, heavy on the claimed, that he panicked and told Tiffany to call 911. And so he got Ammani out of the bathtub, took her to a room, expecting Tiffany to make this 911 call. But ultimately, he said that Tiffany refused to do it. Tiffany told him that Ammani was too thin and that she was still on probation from abusing Ammani in 2010. So obviously, this wouldn't be a good look for her. She said that if they called 911 to come and help Ammani, who was seizing and unresponsive and 32 pounds as a 10-year-old, that their children would be taken away. They would both end up in prison. And so they weren't going to do a thing. And Amman agreed. Amman claimed that over the next couple of days, Ammani remained unresponsive in her room. Like after this, she never came to again. He moved her from the bed to the floor on blankets, likely because she ended up covered in urine. He said that he made attempts to feed her Enfamil with a spoon. He also claimed that he brought up calling for help more than once to Tiffany, but she shut it down every single time. She insisted authorities would see Ammani's condition, connect it to neglect, because it was neglect, and take away their other 2 children. So she urged him instead to, quote, take care of it. Ultimately, I guess they just decided they would wait until she died. In those days that Ammani lay in her bedroom, unresponsive and slowly dying, Amman continued to go to work, Tiffany celebrated her sister's birthday with a night out. And this brings us to October 28th, 2013. Just 4 days later, Ammani told authorities he was working his shift at his first job, and in the middle of it, he got a call or a text from Tiffany. And she said that Ammani was gone. But instead of hearing this, which should have been devastating information, and leaving work, rushing home, trying to figure out what was happening, running to his daughter, he finished up his shift. And this is why I have a really hard time believing anything he says about all the things he did to try and save Ammani and help her and feed her, and how sad he was, because you don't just hear that your daughter is laying dead in her bedroom at home and continue out your shift at work. You just don't. And so he got home a few hours later and found a horrifyingly and equally as calm scene at home. When he walked into the house, his youngest daughter was in her pack and play, his little boy was running around playing, and Tiffany was just relaxing watching TV, rooms away from Ammani, who was lying dead. Ammani said that he went into her room and knew for sure at this point that she was dead. And when he was asked how, he just said he had been to funerals before. And so I'm like, okay, that's disturbing, but all right. He claimed that at this point, he again told Tiffany that they needed to call 911, that they needed to do something. They couldn't just have this dead child in their house. But again, Tiffany just said no. And again, Ammani just accepted it. And so he claimed that he grieved in Ammani's room. And then he, again, with such a ridiculous level of nonchalance, headed off to his second job. Ammani's body remained in that bedroom from the 28th into the 29th. He came home, went to sleep. I mean, they literally acted as if nothing was going on. And at some point on the 29th, possibly into the 30th, I can't say for sure. I can't quite remember what he testified. But Ammani ended up wrapping her in blankets and moved her from her room into the small computer room where she was supposed to be completing her homeschool. And then, as disturbing as it is to imagine, life continued to go as normal in the home. Ammani continued to go to work every day. Tiffany cared for the other two children. She even started to complete Ammani's schoolwork online, hoping to avoid questions as to where Ammani was. Like, during the time Ammani was unresponsive before she died, Tiffany even had a phone call with one of Ammani's online teachers who wanted to speak to her and just BS'd her way through everything. Tiffany then went on to clean Ammani's bedroom. She cleaned the mattress and flipped it over. She went out and purchased clean bedding. Meanwhile, Ammani just laid there decomposing in the computer room. Ammani told authorities that as the days passed, they did discuss what to do with Ammani's body. And Ammani later admitted that Tiffany originally said they needed to bury it somewhere and that they needed to use their criminal minds to figure out how to dispose of her. And ultimately, he said that she suggested burning Ammani's body in a remote location to destroy the evidence. And so on October 30th, Ammani drove to a local Walmart where he ended up buying charcoal, lighter fluid, a galvanized trash can, and trash bags. Now, authorities were able to take this information that Ammani had told them, and they were able to go and collect surveillance footage that did in fact capture Ammani making these purchases at Walmart. And the receipt was also found in their home. And so all of what he was saying was able to be corroborated. And so he said he tried to delay it as long as he could because he didn't want to do it. So still, even after buying these things, for a couple of nights, they continued on like nothing was going on. The following night of the 31st, Tiffany took the kids trick-or-treating. But by November 1st, after Ammani's second shift, they knew they couldn't wait any longer. Ammani claimed that night, when he got home from his shift that ended around midnight to 1 a.m., they began the process of disposing of Ammani. They tried to place Ammani's body into a trash bag to then put into the trash can, but according to Ammani, her body was in a state of rigor mortis. It was very stiff, so it wouldn't fit. So they used the duct tape to compress her limbs into a fetal-like position so she would fit. And this was probably one of the most disturbing things I have heard listening to someone testify, because this man, when he later testified about this in court, with such a straight face, recalled hearing cracking sounds as they forced her limbs into position, and the two of them worked together to duct tape her into a little ball. So again, I have zero sympathy when you can talk about your child like that without so much as changing the inflection in your tone. And so they then filled another trash bag with those items that she had been on or around in the days before and after she died. So her comforter, clothing, blankets, all the things she had soaked in urine because she could not get up. And then they loaded all of this up into their Chevy Trailblazer and grabbed their 2 younger children, put them in the back of the car, and drove to a remote area off of Satellite Boulevard. Ammani said they pulled the trash can out, put it into a grassy area, and doused Ammani's body in lighter fluid, and they added charcoal, and they set everything on fire. Now, the fire didn't last long. It burned hot enough to char the inside of the can, but it's obviously not going to burn long enough or hot enough to actually destroy Ammani's remains. So they had to figure something else out. Ammani said that he initially thought this would be like a cremation, but quickly realized that's not at all how this was going to go. So they decided after just those 5 minutes to smother the fire, wait for the trash can to cool, and put it back in the car before they figured out what to do next. And according to Ammani, Tiffany said, no, at this point, just bury her here. Like, we've already got her body here. We've already tried to burn her and it doesn't work. But Ammani, I guess, didn't want to do that, and with the little amount of conscience he had left, he placed Ammani into the back of his car, and they headed back to the apartment. And at that point, it was already time for him to go back to work. Now, Ammani was understandably kind of freaking out and upset from what he had done, and so he ended up taking the trash can to work with him that next day. Like, he dropped everyone off and just went straight to work with Ammani's body still in the trash can in the back of the Trailblazer. And he said he was just so out of it, like he didn't even realize what he was doing anymore. And his behavior was so off that I guess even his employer noticed and asked him if he was okay. And he almost told them right then and there what he had done, but decided not to and just kept on going about his day. But I guess throughout the day, Ammani just couldn't take it any longer. And so he ended up reaching out to a really close friend of his to meet him at a local Quick Trip after he got off of his shift. And this friend got into Ammani's car, and Ammani just dumped it on him. Like, hey, by the way, my daughter died, and she's burned in the trash can in the back of this car right now. And so this friend was understandably horrified and wanted to run from the car. But ultimately, this friend was like, look, I know now. I already know. It's too late for me. You've got to do the right thing. And this friend encouraged Ammani to call the police. And so it seems like that was really all Ammani needed, was someone else other than Tiffany in his ear for him to finally decide to make the right decision. So Ammani went back home with his mind made up. He knew that there was no saving him or Ammani or Tiffany at this point, but he couldn't keep this secret any longer. So when he got home, he told Tiffany he was calling 911 whether she wanted him to or not. And so in response to this, she freaked out, packed their kids in the car, and raced to her mom's house. When Tiffany showed up at her mom's house in those early morning hours, the first thing out of her mouth was, "Don't let them take my children. Ammani is dead." And again, for whatever reason, Tiffany's mom didn't question a thing. She took in the kids, she took in Tiffany, didn't push for answers, and Tiffany's sister actually drove her to a random place in the middle of nowhere and dropped her off, and Tiffany headed off on foot. And her sister claimed that she had no clue what was going on, why Tiffany needed to be driven to this area. She had no clue Ammani was dead at this point. She just dropped Tiffany off outside of like a gated community and tried to find her way back home. And it was around this time that Ammani finally picked up the phone and called 911. And hours later, both of them were arrested and Ammani's body was found. The truth was finally out, and it was so disturbing. I don't think anyone who initially responded to that call could have guessed how intricate and detailed and messed up the story of this little girl's life was all the way to this point, and how horribly she'd been failed by the two people that were supposed to protect her the most. Authorities had unraveled all of Ammani's confessions. They connected it with evidence, surveillance footage, and data. Meanwhile, Tiffany still remained completely silent. And during all of this, Gwinnett County Medical Examiner's Office also began their work. Dr. Michelle Stauffenberg examined what was left of Ammani's body and confirmed that the cause of death was starvation. Dr. Stauffenberg described her as, quote, more or less skin and bones, with almost no fat or muscle left on her body at all. As I said, she was only 32 pounds as a 10-year-old, and I think the average is like anywhere from like 57, 58 to 100 pounds. The autopsy autopsy findings at this point left no more doubt. They already had everything they needed. This was not the result of an illness or an accident or ingesting chemicals. This was prolonged, deliberate deprivation and abuse. And as much as Ammon wanted to pretend like he didn't know what was happening, he did. He watched it all happen. He was complicit in the entire thing and allowed it to continue on. So within hours, formal charges were filed against both Ammon and Tiffany Moss. They were each charged with malice murder, felony murder, first-degree cruelty to children, and concealing a death. And for prosecutors, this case was already shaping up to be a potential death penalty. Like, this was one of the most heinous crimes they had seen in this area in quite some time. At least they knew they were going to try the death penalty for Tiffany, because very quickly, Ammon ended up agreeing to a plea deal. In order to avoid a possible death sentence, Ammon agreed to plead guilty to all charges and to testify against Tiffany and accept life in prison without the possibility of parole. They knew they could use him as one of their strongest witnesses. The stage was set for a trial unlike anything Gwinnett County had ever seen, and that was just like already given the fact Ammon was going to be testifying, but something very unexpected happened at the trial that I think made it that much more bizarre. But until then, everything felt like it was on pause. All of the people who had tried to help Ammani over the years felt like they had failed, like it was all for nothing. Family members believed they should have done more when they had already done everything they could do. Everyone was so devastated that despite all the pleas for help, all of the obvious issues, those who truly could have made a difference ultimately let Ammani down. Everyone had been doing their due diligence, except for the people that mattered most. And so on November 13th, 2013, more than 200 people gathered to say goodbye to Emani Moss. Many of them were family members, but there were also so many strangers, people from across the community that heard their story and felt compelled to be there to show up for Ammani. The night before, about 50 people also participated in a vigil. They lit candles, they offered prayers in Ammani's memory. And her grandmother, Robin Moss, said, quote, "We need to do for our children because I don't want anyone, any other grandmother, mother, to go through the heartache that I have to go through." And this really acted as a catalyst for reform. Ammani's death sparked urgent action within Georgia's child welfare system because, respectfully, what the on November 14th, 2013, a day after Ammani's funeral, Governor Nathan Deal announced plans that they were going to hire at least 500 new DFCS caseworkers and supervisors, and it was also backed by a $27 million commitment over the next 3 years that hopefully they could reduce their high caseloads, improve response times, which seems to be the biggest issue across the board in people working with DFCS. These caseworkers will have ridiculously high caseloads, so they're not able to pay attention in detail the way that they should be able to. They miss things easier. They don't have time to react as fast. And they ended up acknowledging that 6 separate employees had made oversights while handling Ammani's case. Now, 2 of them were just outright fired, and 4 of them were disciplined or demoted, but they were able to stay. And it was so upsetting to see that that many people played a part in failing her. Like, it was so devastating to read that, because one of them had actually even noted in one of the reports that Ammani appeared very thin and distant, but still somehow, despite saying, hey, yeah, there's definitely something wrong here, dismissed the allegations and performed no follow-up. Like, it was so ridiculous. DFCS also launched an internal review after finding this because they wanted to look at all of the cases that have been screened out to ensure that there weren't similar oversights there as well. And disturbingly, by 2014, more disciplinary reforms followed due to this internal investigation. News reports showed hundreds of DFCS employees disciplined or fired due to performance failures, including things like ignoring red flags, failing to conduct safety investigations. That is literally what saves these children's lives. So at least there was change, but unfortunately, this was a huge problem. And as usual, this change was coming too late for so many children, including Ammani. While those changes were thankfully going on, it ultimately ended up taking more than 5 years for Tiffany to stand trial for the murder of her stepdaughter. So all the people that cared about Ammani, all the people that wanted to see justice, had a very long waiting period to do so. Now, part of that delay obviously just came from the sheer scope of the case. They had tons of evidence, tons of witnesses. Also, being a death penalty case, prosecutors wanted to take their time, but there was another reason it ended up taking so long, one that would make this trial unforgettable in its own right. Tiffany Moss decided she was going to represent herself. The court had appointed 2 defense attorneys to Tiffany that seemed to be great, but she refused them and said that she would go pro se and put it all in God's hands. Those were her words. And that decision stunned the courtroom when she announced it. This isn't like a small criminal matter here or like a civil case. She was facing the harshest penalty, the death penalty. She was accused of starving her 10-year-old stepdaughter with her husband and that little girl's father testifying against her. So obviously there have to be several steps taken to ensure she's competent enough to do that. And so she was in fact found competent. A judge ruled that she could represent herself. And so finally, with that being out of the way, things moved forward. And you never really know when it comes to these pro se situations. Sometimes these people are just absolute narcissists and show up thinking they know exactly what they're talking about, and they make the trial an utter nightmare for everybody involved because they don't know what they're doing. Or sometimes they show up on day one, realize they're way out of their league, and end up getting attorneys anyway. No one was quite sure how this was going to go, but the way that it did go, I don't think anyone could have guessed that, because from the moment jury selection began in April of 2019, Tiffany made it very clear she was not going to fight the charges. She waived her right to make an opening statement. Each time the prosecution finished with a witness, she refused to cross-examine. She had no questions. The prosecution just kept on bringing out witness after witness, piece of evidence after evidence, and there was never an objection or a word from Tiffany, ever. It was by far one of the strangest trials I have ever watched. And the 2 attorneys that had been offered to her were actually ordered to sit behind her in the courtroom on standby just in case she changed her mind. Because again, that's something common that happens. And you can see them just slowly coming undone behind her at every single missed opportunity for a defense. And I know tons of people are going to look at this case, for what it is and say, good, like she doesn't deserve a defense, this, that, and the other, but we technically have a right to one. So this was a pretty tricky situation. And by day 2, these 2 attorneys even stood up afterwards and pleaded with the judge to allow them to represent her, saying, this isn't fair. They found out she had a brain injury at some point in her life. They were worried she wasn't making rash decisions, that she wasn't actually competent. But Tiffany shut them down, and so did the judge, saying, we've already gone through all of this. She's fully fit to represent herself. This is a decision that she wants, and that's that, and Tiffany spent the entire time sitting at her trial, which made things even more confusing, directly looking at the witnesses and listening to what they were saying, and she seemed to be writing things down on her paper. She was dressed very presentable. She was actively participating in every other way except for defending herself in the trial. She was responding to questions politely. She was just choosing not to fight. And that is so confusing. So witness after witness, like I said, came up describing all of the calls to DFCS and the police about the abuse, her teachers who saw Ammani crumble, family members on all sides, including Tiffany's own mother and sister. And obviously one of the most impactful testimonies came from Emani Moss himself. He showed up dressed in prison clothing, escorted by deputies, and he in detail described the months leading up to Ammani's death and Ammani's death itself.
Who called their key witness, the father of 10-year-old Emani Moss, who took a plea deal and is now serving a life sentence for her death. Tiffany Moss is representing herself, and just like with every other witness, she declined to cross-examine her husband. 11 Alive's Caitlin Ross was inside that courtroom. Caitlin, did she show any emotion during the testimony, any reaction whatsoever?
No emotion at all. It was really bizarre. You just watched her just sit there stone-faced. She did actually keep eye contact with her husband the entire time. She kept really trying to look at him, trying to focus on him. He refused to look at her. I thought it was really telling when he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. She was staring at him the entire time. He refused to look back at her. And while he was on the stand, he didn't make any excuses for what they had done.
It did was when the incident happened, and called 911. And when I didn't, I put myself in a bad bind. Because she said, I'm on probation, I don't want to go to jail. Don't make any sense. I guess I was trying to fix the problem that I couldn't fix. I was trying to save her, but I couldn't save her. I couldn't save my daughter. I can't explain.
The courtroom was very visibly disturbed by what they were hearing out of Amon's mouth, which made it even more upsetting that Amon really showed no emotion. Just as Tiffany hadn't the entire trial. You would expect Amon to shed a tear for his daughter, or maybe for him to take a second to breathe and gather himself while describing the noise his daughter's bones made in his hands as he forcibly shoved her into a trash can, but there was nothing. There was nothing there for either of them. Jurors heard from medical experts who detailed how her body had wasted away, and they heard from investigators who walked them through the night of November 2nd, 2013, and the moment that they opened up that trash can to find Ammani's remains. The prosecution in total presented more than 20 witnesses over 4 days, and that entire time, Tiffany asked no questions. She gave no explanation for what she did, no apology. When it came time for closing arguments, she stood briefly and very politely told the jury that she had nothing to say. And so it ended up taking the jury just a few hours to return a unanimous verdict. Tiffany was found guilty on all counts. And again, when being read this, Tiffany didn't even flinch. And I kept watching this clip over and over. I wanted to see something from her, but there was just nothing. Her standby attorneys behind her reacted with so much more emotion than even she did. In the sentencing phase, the prosecution continued on, and it seemed like at points even they felt weird. Even they were trying to make sure, are you sure you don't want to say anything or bring anyone forward or, something. The prosecution was having this one-sided argument, which just doesn't feel right in a courtroom, but they continued on making their case for the death penalty, pointing to all the aggravating factors, and Tiffany once again declined to speak on her own behalf. She offered no plea for mercy, she brought forward no character witnesses, and on April 29th, 2019, the jury recommended death. Tiffany Moss became the only woman on Georgia's death row at the time. There was a lot of talk during and after the trial and after this extreme sentencing was handed down about Tiffany's competency because so many people, including well-known attorneys, felt that something was clearly wrong, that if she was going to represent herself and not actually do anything to represent herself or defend herself, that clearly she was not competent. And when you're being given something like the death sentence, you've got to make sure you get it right. So there was this huge uproar, but not a lot of people agreed with that. Some said it is just as much her right to refuse an attorney, to refuse to actually defend herself. And this brought on a lot of speculation as to why she even made the choice she did. And a lot of people felt like it was her way of trying to guilt the jury, that she knew the overwhelming evidence would end in her guilt, even if she had the best of the best working alongside her. But maybe she could avoid the death penalty if she seemed meek and quiet and in a position where she was essentially just getting steamrolled. But others believed that she just knew she was guilty, but wanted that to be fully determined by others without putting up a fight on her side. But then that made people question, why didn't she just plead guilty and not waste everyone's time at this trial? And that led a lot of people to believe it was just her way of maintaining control. But unfortunately, we'll probably never know why she chose to do things the way that she did. And ultimately, it was just all chatter and the weight of a moment that never should have come to begin with, because no sentence, not a life in prison, not the death penalty, could ever bring back this little girl, 10-year-old Emani Moss. For Ammani's relatives, the verdicts were not victories. I don't think they are for anyone sitting there. They're just acknowledgments, official recognition of what Tiffany and Ammani had done, the unimaginable pain that Ammani had endured before her death. And at the sentencing, the weight of the courtroom was almost physical. Every person inside seemed to carry it, from the deputies that had worked the case to the reporters who had followed every hearing to the jurors that sat through days of testimony and the most graphic photographs that were going to stick in the back of their mind for the rest of their lives. And outside of the legal proceedings, grief still hung heavy. Ammani's grandmother shared her heartbreak in an interview.
I want to cry right now. It's just a lot. It's just a whole lot.
Robin Moss takes this colorful beaded keychain with her everywhere she goes. Her precious granddaughter Emani made it for her. She says she thinks about Emani every single day.
Her smile, the way we used to talk head to head, the silly things she used to do.
Robin says she never really had a good relationship with her daughter-in-law.
The only thing she used to always say that my son was a mama's boy, and that she was going to change him. I just asked the Lord, if there's no truth to come out of her mouth, then don't let her say anything.
Robin still holds resentment toward DFCS. She fought but failed to get custody of Ammani when she suspected abuse.
If they would have did their job, when she got beat the first time, that's sign number 1. Ran away, sign number 2. Ran away again, sign number 3. I mean, how many signs do you have to have?
Words carry the pain of a family that will never be the same. I mean, their own son, brother, loved one allowed this to happen to his little girl, and they had tried to save her, and it just wasn't enough. How do you wrangle all those different layers of betrayal and grief and sorrow? And in the days following the sentence, Ammani's photo circulated on TV and news sites across the country. People who had never met her began to ask how a child with so many warning signs could be failed so completely. And so a lot of people started to donate to different advocacy groups in her name. Others were using her story to push for stronger child welfare oversight. It will always be so beautiful to me to see tragedies like this turned into something good for the future. And Ammani being a peacekeeper, being someone that always wanted to step in and make things right for everyone and make sure everyone was happy and safe, it's exactly what she would have wanted. But despite all of the ugly pain and the horror in Ammani's death, the beauty of her life, the good parts of it, they were still remembered. Even years later, her former 4th grade teacher, Lisa Neal, still remembered the little girl that she taught and just how precious she was. While Ammani's life was stolen from her, her memory was now driving these important conversations that her abusers never wanted to happen, about accountability and vigilance and the responsibility that adults have to protect children, no matter how uncomfortable it may be to speak up. I feel like we have this tendency to think that abuse always looks very obvious, that someone will step in before it gets that bad. But the truth is that sometimes the worst abuse hides in plain sight, masked by closed doors, withdrawn children, and very, very carefully crafted lies. And so if you take anything at all from Ammani's story, I want it to be not to wait. Do not second guess yourself. If something feels off, if a child's appearance changes drastically, if they're isolated, if they seem scared or withdrawn, please report it. I feel like I have seen so many cases with situations like this just in the last few weeks alone. And with all these students now going back to school after months of being potentially in a home with their abuser and no oversight, I just want teachers out there and caregivers and all these people to remember cases like this and how important it is to speak up. Even if you're wrong, the cost of speaking up is nothing compared to the cost of staying silent. Ammani's voice may have been stolen, but ours certainly wasn't. And that's exactly why my channel is what it is. It's exactly why it exists. We can use our voices to make sure that fewer children slip through the crack, to spread awareness in all sorts of true crime cases so that we can be more aware. We can prevent these things from happening. We will never fix this world overnight, but we can always do better. Every single day, we can do better. And eventually, that will make a difference. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.